Imagine Brussels on June 30th, 2026, a date most economists will ignore, most voters won't notice, but in a single bureaucratic moment, something vanishes. 30 billion in annual green energy funding simply stops. No announcement, no ceremony. The Next Generation EU Fund, the financial backbone of Europe's greatest climate ambition, expires. The money that rebuilt renewable grids, retrofitted millions of homes, and turned factories green overnight? Gone. Here's the unsettling truth. Europe's 1.2 trillion climate transition was never designed to work without it. As we enter 2026, with 4 years left to meet the 2030 climate deadline, the European Green Deal faces a silent catastrophe. Not climate denial, not political opposition, something worse, a mathematical reality that no government has solved. The EU promised to cut emissions 55% by 2030. If current plans hold, they'll hit 54%, 1 percentage point, and they're already missing it. So the question isn't whether Europe cares about climate. The question is, has Europe already decided it can afford to fail? In 2026, the EU's largest climate funding source expires, and nobody has a replacement plan. The EU committed to cutting emissions 55% by 2030. That requires 842 billion euros spent every year. Most of that money comes from the Next Generation EU Fund, 195 billion euros annually into climate projects across member states. But here's the problem. This fund expires December 31st, 2026. When it does, annual climate investment drops from 50 billion euros to 20 billion euros. That's a 30 billion euro hole every year for the next 4 years. Let me give you the numbers that matter. The EU needs 842 billion euros annually to hit its 2030 target. Next Generation EU provides 50 billion euros yearly. That ends in 2026. After 2026, available funding drops to 20 billion euros per year. Current climate plans show a 150 billion euro annual financing gap. Member states are already projected to hit only 54% reduction, not the required 55%. That's the math. 30 billion euros disappears. A 150 billion euro gap already exists, and they're still 1 percentage point short. If member states step up, they absorb costs into national budgets, funding continues, targets are met. If they don't, investments slow, decarbonization stalls. Europe misses 2030 targets for the first time. Which happens? Depends on decisions being made right now. But funding is only half the problem. Even with money, Europe's climate targets are becoming mathematically impossible. That's next. Europe's climate targets weren't just underfunded. They were mathematically fragile from the start. The EU promised 55% emissions cuts by 2030. That target was set in 2019, before COVID, before energy prices tripled, before industries relocated. The model assumed industrial decarbonization would accelerate as planned. Member states would implement carbon pricing uniformly. Consumer behavior would shift toward green energy voluntarily. Technology costs would fall faster than historical precedent. None of that has happened at the projected rate. Here's what the data shows. current trajectory shows only 54% reduction by 2030, not 55%. To close that 1% gap requires $80 to $120 billion in additional investment. Member states have allocated only $35 billion toward closing it. Industrial emissions are falling slower than 2019 projections predicted. Germany, Europe's industrial engine, is already missing interim 2025 targets. That 1% gap isn't a rounding error. It represents billions in unmet climate commitments. More critically, it reveals the structural problem. Europe built climate targets on assumptions that broke. But here's where it gets worse. Even if member states find the money, even if they absorb the $30 billion gap, there's a competing crisis. The grid can't handle what's coming. Renewable energy infrastructure requires 4 to 6 years to build. Solar farms, wind turbines, grid upgrades, storage systems. If construction slows due to funding cuts in 2026, those projects won't be operational until 2030 to 2032. By then, Europe has already missed its deadline. This is the hidden time bomb. It's not just about money anymore. It's about whether Europe's infrastructure can physically support the transition in the time remaining. So which scenario unfolds? If governments prioritize climate funding, they cut spending elsewhere. Healthcare, defense, infrastructure maintenance. Political backlash follows. If they don't, energy transition slows, emissions targets slip. Europe faces first major climate miss in the Green Deal era. The choice being made right now in Brussels, Berlin, Paris determines which future materializes. But there's one more angle nobody discusses, one that could change everything. What if Europe doesn't fail alone? The 2030 climate deadline isn't European, it's global. India, China, the United States, all racing toward their own targets, all discovering the same thing: the transition costs more than anyone budgeted. If Europe misses 2030, it signals something devastating to the rest of the world. Climate ambition has a limit. It's achievable only if you're wealthy, if your grid is old enough to replace, and if you can absorb costs into your economy. Developing nations watching this play out will ask a logical question. Why sacrifice our growth for targets the wealthy can't even hit? Here's the compounding crisis. If EU emissions reduction slips to 54% instead of 55%, that's 50 to 80 million additional metric tons of CO2 entering the atmosphere annually. Global emissions would see approximately 0.08% increase, minor but symbolically massive. Carbon markets would destabilize, triggering price crashes that undermine green investment worldwide. Political momentum for climate action would fracture at the exact moment it needs strengthening. This isn't speculation, it's the scenario climate economists are quietly modeling. But, and this is critical, there's a grounded counterargument. Europe has missed interim targets before and accelerated after. In 2019, the EU was tracking 37% reduction by 2030. Today, it's tracking 54%. That's acceleration. Governments respond to pressure. If 2026 forces a reckoning, emergency funding could follow, similar to how COVID triggered $750 billion in emergency spending. So what actually happens? One of three scenarios unfolds by 2027. Member states find replacement funding, either through new EU mechanisms or national budgets. Targets stay on track. The crisis was avoidable, just expensive. Funding stalls, but technology accelerates. Battery costs drop faster, solar becomes cheaper, grid efficiency improves. Targets are technically met despite lower investment. Both fail. Funding disappears, technology adoption slows, and Europe misses 2030 targets for the first time. The political fallout reshapes climate policy globally. The evidence points towards a mix of scenarios 1 and 2, with scenario 3 as a tail risk. But the decisions made in 2026, when that $30 billion disappears, will determine which outcome actually happens. And that's the real question. Europe solved the climate crisis once mathematically. They proved it was possible. The question now is whether they'll solve it politically.